And next, we move into the first substantive session, I think it's fair to say, with a gentleman, quite frankly, who has significant responsibility with regard to the river and what it is doing and how it shall be handled in the future. We're delighted to have Major General John Peabody with us today, the commander of the Mississippi Valley Division of the U.S. Corps of Engineers and the president of the Mississippi River Commission. General, thank you very much for coming.
Well, good morning, everybody. I think I know most of you in the room, and I think many of you can appreciate me saying that coming back to Chicago after spending so much time here in my previous job seems somewhat like returning to the scene of the Asian carp crime. I'm happy to say that the Corps has made great progress on that front. There's still much work to do. But all the information that we have indicates that the Asian carp, or the fish barrier, that the Chicago district continues to operate is working fantastically well. In fact, the last information I got from our senior biologist, Kelly Bearwalt, was that of, I think, 200 fish they've tagged in and around the barrier for telemetry. They've got over 8 million hits. Not a single fish has crossed from one side to the other. Of course, they've tried to tag some of the smaller fish, which may or may not be as susceptible to the electrical impulses. But it really is great to be here. This is an incredibly important event, and I very much regret that I can't be here tomorrow. I was on the horns of a dilemma, Mr. Milling. This is tomorrow's session, and the discussions you're going to have is really kind of the pulling together of all the multiple conferences you had. I really wanted to be here to listen and learn from those discussions, but tomorrow's also my wife's birthday. So,
discretion is a better part of valor.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. So unfortunately, I will not be here for that. I have a rather long presentation, and fortuitously, my time is starting early. So I'm probably going to take a little bit more time than I'm allocated, but I don't think that'll affect our overall agenda. The issues that we face have really already been well described by by Mr. Milling and both Governor Quinn and Lieutenant Governor Dardanelle, and that is that there's, as the senior trainer at the National Training Center told me when I was Lieutenant Colonel, John Henry, there ain't no free chicken in the desert. That was my call sign, John Henry, at the time. We are struggling to carry out various purposes, we the nation, various purposes in this great watershed that at the end of the day, we cannot perfectly balance. And further, as we carry out some of these purposes, we learn, because the river operates in geologic time, not in human terms of time, that there are consequences, second, third, or fourth, fifth order consequences that occur that we don't fully appreciate, recognize, or understand at the time that we carry out one purpose or another. And so one of the messages I would have for you is we need to have a certain amount of humility in the face of this great challenge. Because what we know today is certainly orders of magnitude more than what our parents, our grandparents, their parents and grandparents knew when they contended with these issues, but it is certainly far less than what our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren will know and be able to apply going down the line. With that, is somebody, do I have the ability to, yay, okay, great. They don't train me well on operating IT devices. Big context. My predecessor, Mike Walsh, would talk about this being the third largest watershed in the world, and that's true, but it's not the whole story. The whole story is it's the largest naturally navigable watershed in the world because some of the other larger watersheds in the world tend to be much wilder, as wild as the Mississippi is in its natural state. The Amazon, the Congo are the two larger ones. And these are the three great watersheds. There's lots of other great rivers. The Rhine, the Ganges, the Yangtze, the Indus, the Yellow. But they're not great watersheds. They pale in comparison to the scale and scope of the geographic area drained by the Mississippi, the Amazon, and the Congo. Difference being, of course, we live in a temperate zone. This is in a temperate zone. And so it's susceptible to intense agricultural development, as depicted on that map. George Friedman from Stratfor posits that this is one of the critical bases for American greatness. I happen to agree. Now, when we nug that down and we look at this in a little bit more detail, we find that when you combine the inland waterway system that has been improved by both private and governmental interests, meant much by the Corps of Engineers, that there's more miles, 12,000 miles of navigable waterways in these United States than the entire rest of the world combined. That is an astonishing factoid. That gives us an incredible economic advantage when it comes to moving goods. We can do it more cheaply, at lower cost, more reliably, and more environmentally friendly, because you can move tons of goods for much less carbon input into the atmosphere. Now, look, when you look at this slide, one of the reasons I love about this slide is it screams how important Louisiana is. That intense port activity you see in the greater port of New Orleans, which is the largest port in the United States, port complex in the United States, is for two reasons. Primarily, in some sense, it's because that's where the great watershed meets the ocean, and so that's where you transit cargo. Ocean-going vessels come in, barges come down, they move cargo off ships and onto others, they move cargo on and off dock handling facilities to rail and truck, but also it's because of the incredible energy wealth that underlies Louisiana coast and environs. When I look back at the history of the Corps of Engineers, it's a great history, and it's really the history of the development of the country. But one of the crises that we face today, in my opinion, is a crisis of deteriorating infrastructure. In the last century, we were all born in the last century, the 20th century, we really built out that infrastructure, and it started with the canalization of the Ohio River. 50 locks and dams, now 20, along the Ohio River. By the way, we're not even done modernizing that because of the Olmsted Project. I'll talk about that later. The infamous Olmsted Project. And we did a great job, and it had a lot of great purposes, but there were consequences. The infrastructure consequence was, as Mr. Milling said, we started taking for granted that which we had built. Most of us, and certainly our children, grew up with this infrastructure already in place. The problems that this infrastructure was designed to solve no longer existed, at least not apparently, to most of the citizens. So we had this period of vision and construction, and then we went into a period of benign neglect. Multiple reasons for that. Part is it's just the natural course of things. Part is we started recognizing in the 60s and 70s that we were having some serious environmental consequences. We passed a series of environmental laws that started focusing this agency much more in that direction. It's entirely appropriate to do. But we also took for granted what we had, and we started putting fiscal pressures on it as a result of all the fiscal dynamics that we really started seeing in the late 70s and early 80s. Those trends have continued. And I can't point to a point in time and say this is when the crisis started. But we are certainly at a point now where we are in a crisis in terms of ability to maintain that infrastructure. Now, you are all taxpayers. You all contribute funds through your income taxes and other methods, Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, Inland Waterway Trust Fund, to what the Corps delivers. Congratulations, this is the infrastructure that you own. Not a pretty picture. And I could have showed dozens of photographs that would look similar and some even worse. And this is just the Mississippi. It's actually worse than the Ohio River, which General Bertram has responsibility for. The best trend that I can use, this is just locks, okay? I'm just kind of focusing on locks here. to indicate how we're performing and what direction we're heading in is lock outages. And there's two types. There's planned. That's what's in the green on those bars year by year over the last 20 years. And then there's the red or the blue hatched. And that's basically unplanned, which means something broke and we had to stop locking ships and had to fix it. That's up almost 600% or about 600% in the last 20 years. This is clearly an unsustainable path that we're on, an unsustainable trend. And yet, we're really not getting a whole bunch of extra money to be able to deal with it. A little over 2 weeks ago, the area in Louisiana called Algiers Lock, a critical component on the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway, passes about 30 million tons of cargo a year, broke catastrophically, and we're still struggling to fix it. We're really not sure when we're going to be able to fix it because we just finished the investigation. Now we're doing the engineering, and it's probably going to be 2, maybe 3 months before we get this fixed. In the meantime, barges have to go through the Harvey Canal, just to the left of that red oval, and it's much smaller. There's a queue of somewhere around upwards of 60 hours today, which costs an enormous amount of money to the barge industry, which at some point in time has to be passed on to us consumers. Watch care. Whoa, what is going on there? What happened there? I never go anywhere without showing this video because it's so dramatic. We just happened to have a camera posted on the Lockport Lock and Dam project when we were remediating the perched pool wall in the Chicago Sanitary Ship Canal, just 20 miles or so south of here. And all of a sudden, this 1890s vintage wall collapsed and fell into the pool. Now, thankfully, nobody was hurt, nobody was killed, but you saw, everybody running around, scurrying, some in the wrong direction. As a result of that, the theory that our infrastructure might fall is not just a theory. It has happened. Thankfully, in this case, it didn't really impact navigation for a long period of time. Nobody was killed. The damages weren't huge. I think it cost us about $3 or $4 million to fix this. But we don't have an abundance of money to deal with these issues, and it is an enormous challenge. Now, when you look at the, there'll be an eye test on this later. When you look at the upper Mississippi and Illinois waterway, we've had 6 projects that we have rehabilitated over the last several years, 10 years, decade or so. And the light blue indicates what was funded through the President's budget. The dark blue indicates the Stimulus Act, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and about half of that was from the ERA funds. We would not have been able to complete these rehabs. Lock 27 for my navigation friends, 60 million tons a year. We would still be low crawling forward to completing that today if it had not been for these funds, and we'll be done with that in just a month or two. So the stimulus was great, right? Solved all our problems. Well, not really. This is the project everybody loves to hate. I'm not going to talk in detail about this, but this is a visionary project. We're using cutting-edge construction techniques, which turned out to be much more expensive than we estimated when we estimated the dam component of the project. And because of the Inland Waterway Trust Fund limitations, and because the Corps has been sub-optimized in its funding of this project for all but 3 of the 24 or 5 years that we've been putting this under construction, it's going to take us several more years to complete it. But, now let me go back. I don't have a picture. But we don't really have a choice. This is one where we just need to bite the bullet and get it done, because here's the reality. Lock and Dam 52 and 53, which were the last ones to be built in the Ohio River when it was originally done in the late 20s, are falling apart. And 52 is an active failure. The dam has subsided 4 to 6 inches in the last year, and it's not because of gas and oil extrapolation. Okay, that's not why it's doing it. It's failing. We're so afraid of how fragile it is that we're afraid that if we just did the testing we would need to understand what's happening, it might cause catastrophic failure. And that would mean that the Ohio River would not be navigable, the hub of the inland waterway transportation system, for several months every year. We've got to get this done. Okay, so the Corps, the Lieutenant Governor talked about the flood of 1927, and Governor Quinn talked about the flood of 2011. There you see some dramatic photographs of the Morganza spillway, some damages to Wapapello highway area, a sand boil that was the size of an Olympic swimming pool in the upper right. I actually visited that site, and some flooding to some structures in Natchez. This was the largest flood by volume in the history of the Mississippi River. Anywhere from a quarter to almost 50% larger by volume than the 1927 flood, which the folks in 1927 certainly could not have imagined. Yet, it was not the largest catastrophe in the history of the Mississippi River. In fact, it barely caught the media's attention, partly because Osama bin Laden was being killed at about the same time we operated the floodways, partly because no one died. I mean, it was very dramatic video coverage for a couple weeks there, but it's past the Americans' imagination now. And yet, nearly $250 billion in damages were prevented because of the success of the Mississippi River Tributaries Project and the way we operated the system. Fortunately, nothing failed. It doesn't mean we can pass another flood like that today and it'll work, because there's been lots of damages. Nearly $200 billion of that was in Louisiana alone, and that puts a huge exclamation point on how important Louisiana infrastructure is to moving cargo, to developing energy, to managing the commerce of this nation. This is a 44-to-1 return on the American people's investment over the history of the project. There's few things we build that have that kind of benefit to cost ratio. And yet, as complex and great as this system is, now we're going through an intense analysis to figure out what we need to fix, what we need to repair. We've got money to do that, but that money is only about 60% of what we need to do all the repairs. And now we're going to have to start prioritizing, you know, do we keep going forward with repairs? Do we complete the project? We're going to have to figure out how to balance that. Plus, we have to analyze whether the project design flood is adequate, because the project design flood is based on a series of three mega storms systems coming through. We had 2 of those systems come through, and yet we had up to about 85% of the flow for the project design flood was passed. It may not be adequate for some future storm event. And as Governor Quinn talked about, you know, just when you think you've got nature beat, right, nature throws another curveball at you and humbles us once again. The 2012 drought was a dramatic reminder that it's not just floods that the Mississippi River tributary and other core projects are designed to prevent or enable navigation during, which we maintain throughout the flood for the most part, a few minor exceptions. But drought as well. Largest drought in over 50 years, but again, we maintain navigation. We had over 90 groundings in the Mississippi River from June of 12 to January of 13. Not a single one of those was in the channel. Not a single one. And you can see there's kind of where they all occurred. Why? Well, was it because of the dredging? That was certainly part of it. It was a key part of it, and that's what people see. They see what happens in response at the time. We were very lucky in that we had over $200 million from the flood supplemental to apply to dredging the year after the flood during the drought. If we had not had that money, none of the ports and harbors up and down the Mississippi, which are the on-ramps and off-ramps for agricultural productivity, commerce, and for energy commerce, they would not have been dredged. And we would have struggled mightily to keep the river itself open. The rock removal got a lot of attention. We lowered the riverbed by 2 feet. There's never been a point in history, knock on wood here, where the river's gotten so low that at the new lower bed stage that would prevent commerce from going through. But the real hero is what's in the upper left corner, and that's the training structures that we've been building throughout the course of the last 50 years. These training structures, these dikes, these chevrons, make the decisive difference in encouraging the river to stay in the channel in which it is, the stable channel that it's in, and ensure navigation and make sure the river is optimally efficient during very low water. Couldn't do it without that. And then, of course, you didn't think I was going to talk about hurricanes here. Big river moves, right? But again, the port of New Orleans, the city of New Orleans, is decisive for commerce in this country. It cannot function unless there's a certain confidence that protection from major storms will occur. Well, of course, we had Hurricane Isaac, which is kind of the vertical line there, and then Hurricane Katrina 8 years ago, and then Hurricane Isaac comes through 7 years later, dramatically small. It was only a Category 1, right? But it moved very slowly, 3 times more slowly, on a different path, and as a result, dumped a heck of a lot more rain, up to 20 inches in some places, mostly around the Lake Pontchartrain area where we saw a lot of flooding, and we had huge storm surge. This storm surge actually was similar to the storm surge we saw with Katrina, not quite as high, but close. And yet, you see in the area in the gray there, that's the greater New Orleans area protected by the new Hurricane Storm Damage Risk Reduction System, virtually no flooding in the system. Senator Landrieu called it a miracle. I don't know if it was a miracle, but it was certainly the result of the national commitment, just like we had after the 1927 flood, to prevent a future catastrophe from occurring again. It was also the result of some incredibly intense forensics. What happened to Katrina? Some incredibly intense research in terms of science, cutting-edge technology, and the application of those, and, of course, full funding up front. We don't get that very often. We got it in this case. We're not done. We're about 2/3 of the way done in terms of construction, the money available. But the Greater New Orleans system, for the most part, is complete and will be turned over the next couple of months to CPRA, Mr. Jerome Zering, and Mr. Graves and their team, and all the levee boards, and they will be operating the bulk of the program in the Greater New Orleans area from this point forward. Still have environmental mitigation to do. Still got a lot of work to do in Plaquemines Parish and in other areas. Hurricane Isaac. Focus on the photo in the lower right and try to read that while I say a couple words about this. I was privileged to be asked by Governor Jindal during the course of the response to this storm to go with him in many areas, and as a result I was able to take a lot of pictures. On the left is a picture of Laplace. This area was not flooded during Katrina. It experienced dramatic flooding from Isaac because of the storm surge coming up Lake Pontchartrain, the rain coming down. They got trapped between the Lake Pontchartrain and the river, and you can see the flooding there. And then the lower right is Lafitte, about 20 miles, I think, or so south of New Orleans. They don't have a hurricane storm damage risk reduction system. They want one. And they feel they've been promised a system over the years, and we haven't been allocated the money to do that. So, you know, where is our levee system? Why are we outside of a system? Now let me kind of conclude with a hugely challenging topic for all of us, and that is coastal subsidence and wetland loss in Louisiana, due to a whole host of variables, some of which have been talked about. On the left is the relative rate of sea level rise in Pensacola, Florida, a couple hundred miles, I think, to the east on the coast, and on the left. On the right is Grand Isle, which is the one gauge that we've had for a long period of time. There's some other gauges, but we don't have the time period of data. And you can see a big difference. There's clearly something different going on in coastal Louisiana than there is in the panhandle of Florida that causes this difference. Now, we know the causes. There they are. There's 11 of them. I'm not going to recite them to you. These are the reasons. What we don't know, certainly not with adequate specificity yet, we're working on it, is what are the proportional amounts and how do they reinforce each other? How do cutting canals and saltwater intrusion reinforce the subsidence that's going on or the sea level rise? How does the lack of resedimentation nourishment that no longer occurs because we don't allow the river to flood, at least not in dramatic fashion outside of its banks. How does that influence it? We're really not sure, but we're investigating. One point though, the area in red is the area that's influenced by the Mississippi River. So if we did let the river do what it normally would do, basically the greater Mississippi River, deltaic area, and the Atchafalaya would renourish. The area in blue is not influenced by the Mississippi River, and yet we're seeing substantially equal amounts of land loss in both areas. That's not a scientific approach to that, I recognize that, but it's an indicator that this is not just about the Mississippi River. The Corps is partnered with the state of Louisiana, Dr. Reed, Dr. Twilley, and others to work on a river hydrodynamic study that's going to help give us the data, the facts, and I'm not going to recite all those, to get after this. But what we want to figure out is, you know, what do we know about the sediment, its availability, how it works, how the water moves, where is it in the water column, what are the cumulative impacts of diversions, how can we optimize diversions so that they'll be optimally effective, and then how it will affect things like the saltwater wedge in the river, and navigation. One of the challenges is, you know, we're going to do this study in a matter of a few years, but the river responds over much longer periods of time. So it's very difficult to draw conclusions from a few years study. And this just shows you where the river is aggregating in red. In other words, there's sediment being dropped and the bed's actually rising, where the river is degrading in blue, which is basically around New Orleans and a little bit below, and then where it's essentially in dynamic equilibrium. This is fascinating to me, and I want to understand more about it. There's not a lot we know about why, but we do know that as the river approaches head of passes, it starts its sediment load starts leaking out. It starts going out somewhere. Where is it going? That's what we're not exactly sure of. We hope to find out, but it's about 20% of itself when it gets down to the end of Southwest Pass. So while there certainly is some sediment, and it's very fine, the vast majority of it, the sands are the light brown. There's no question that there's sediment that's going out into the Gulf, but it's a relatively small proportion of the sediment that's available to us. Again, I'm not going to try to brief the details of this. I'm still struggling to understand it myself because, and the details matter in this case. But what we do know is there's clear evidence that this is a Bonnie Carey spillway area, that over time, diversions can cause river shoaling in certain areas. So when we do these diversions, we need to do them in a way that minimizes shoaling so we don't induce additional dredging requirements. And similarly, there's system-wide impacts. One diversion will affect another. Again, I'm not going to get into the details here, but we're working very hard to try to understand this so we can put together a system that's going to work. Let me close by, again, thanking everybody for being here. You know, we, the Corps, we don't do anything without an authority, an appropriation, and most importantly, perhaps, partners and stakeholders who work with us, who collaborate with us, who criticize us, who encourage us, who collaborate with us, and work with us together to try to find these solutions. And these are just some of the partners that we work with. And of course, America's Wetlands Foundation is on there. I got this from Dr. John Briscoe at Harvard. He has been working with us on the Harvard Water Security Initiative. And I just love it. One of the reasons I love it is my wife and I adopted our daughter from China 2 years ago, so I'm kind of into things Chinese these days. But it's kind of a simplified view of how mankind needs to approach water resources wisely invest in infrastructure to achieve outcomes for the benefit of all of us. Lastly, very lastly, we had some kids on the Motor Vessel Mississippi. We had our annual spring and high water inspection trip this week, and some kids from Vicksburg came on. It just reminded me, you know, these are the kids we're working for. I mean, these are my clients as I think of it. And what we've got to do is make sure that we choose wisely, that we work together, we get the data right, we get the science right, and we make the best possible choices so that we are leaving a positive legacy for future generations, and they don't have the same problems that we're dealing with today. Thanks for your time. I look forward to discussions later, and I apologize if I went a little bit long.
Thanks, General.